I just wanted to do a quick thoughts video on Oblivion Remastered. I know it came out like a year ago, so it's a little bit late, but I just finished my second playthrough of the game, and I wanted to give a little perspective on what I thought about playing Oblivion Remastered, coming from the perspective of someone who did not enjoy the original release of Oblivion when it came out, close to 20 years ago. So in a lot of ways, this is going to be a thoughts video of both the remaster and the original Oblivion, since, the content is essentially the same. So I guess I'll start with my history with the Elder Scrolls games in general. I never played Arena, but I did play Daggerfall way back in the day. Now, I don't think I bought Daggerfall right when it came out, but I definitely played it before Morrowind did. It was probably somewhere on the bargain shelf when I bought it and played it. And I definitely remember having a good time with Daggerfall. For the life of me, I can't remember whether or not I actually ever beat it. I definitely remember having to refer to some old text-based guides or something like that to get through parts of it. But I have zero... I feel like I beat it. I have recollection of some imagery of some of the final dungeons and stuff like that, but I have no idea if that's from looking at guides for it or if I actually did that myself. Regardless of my foggy memories from, close to 30 years ago, I had a good time with it, or at least I remember having a good time with it. Particularly, I love the flexibility it gave you in character generation in terms of how that basically weighting how powerful your class was versus the progression speed of it and stuff like that. I thought that was a really great system. I definitely remember, farming up, spending large amounts of time farming up Daedric gear and stuff like that to build the super tanky character. This is going back way back in the memory bank, so I don't remember a lot of details, but generally speaking, I remember having a good time with it. So I was genuinely excited when Morrowind was announced, and that was one I actually bought pretty much right away when it came out. And I remember immediately there was this initial off-putting moment of how stiffly the first soldier in the boat walks up to you. The animation just looked really bad. But then I got into the game, and it was definitely a world that I got lost in. I did actually definitely beat Morrowind, and I didn't actually use any guides or anything like that. It was pretty easy to follow and get along through it. I remember loving a lot of the dwarven mines and a lot of the lore and history related to the disappearance of the dwarves. Meeting the last living dwarf was a moment that seemed really cool. The world design there, just being able to travel through this very unique, almost alien society was really great. Definitely the entire world of Morrowind was unique enough that I was really drawn into it, and I spent a ton of time just exploring all the corners of it. Really strong, good memories of playing Morrowind. So of course, when the original Oblivion came out, I was, again, super amped for that. It came out, and I never finished it. Sometimes a game hits you at a point in your life, and I remember when Oblivion came out, I believe I was kind of going through a power gaming phase, which I'm much better off having gotten out of that, and I enjoy games a lot more when I'm not actually doing that. So because of the way Oblivion's leveling system worked and me being in this kind of regrettable power gaming phase, I ended up just replaying the beginning portions of that game a lot as I was kind of figuring out the systems. When I first played the game back those days, I didn't like looking at guides and stuff like that. So I would, play a little bit of the ways in, be figuring out the systems, and then be like, oh, this could have been better. I could have done this, that, and that. Start over a character, try and do it better. So I remember replaying the early portions of the original release of Oblivion, the early Mages Guild quests, the early Fighters Guild quests, stuff like that. I remember doing that several times. Not sure exactly how many times. Just with each progressive iteration, having figured out a little bit more, going back and trying to make my character better, stronger, all that sort of stuff. And, I don't know exactly how many times it was, the third or fourth or fifth time of doing that early portion of the game. I just, took a step back and I was like, you know what? No. And it was this combination of factors. It was the fact that it seemed like work to make a character that I wanted to play, in combination with a much more vanilla setting than Morrowind, and the way that the enemies were scaling with the character just didn't feel right either. So where Oblivion hit me at the original release of the game and where I was in terms of how I played games at that point in my life, it just didn't work for me, and I didn't like it. And yeah, I had probably put, tens of hours into the game, but then just stopped and never finished it. And because of that, I never played Skyrim either. Kind of like killed off the series for me a little bit. And looking back and comparing the leveling and progression system of Morrowind to Oblivion, they're almost identical. But Oblivion's felt worse to me at that time. And I think it's just the two main factors were the world scaling around you in Oblivion, which didn't happen in Morrowind, and something as simple as changing the training to be more limited in Oblivion. Where in Morrowind, if you wanted to have, multiple attributes go up by 5 at a level up, well, they went up most of the way naturally, and then you just had to spend a few points in training to get them up to 5. In Oblivion, you could maybe get one up to 5 pretty easily, but if you wanted to get a second one up to 5, never mind even getting a third one up, it was work to do that. And the underlying fallacy in that is that you didn't have to get everything up to 5 and you could still have a fun time in the game. But like I said, I was kind of going through this power gaming phase, and in my brain it's like, you have to have like 3 attributes increased by 5 every level up. And that was kind of easy to do in Morrowind. It was not easy or fun to do in Oblivion. So fast forward to the announcement for Oblivion Remastered, and it was the score that pulled me in. Like, I remember watching the trailers for it, or the announcements, and, that opening cinematic and the score of Oblivion, which, is, again, harkening back to that score of Morrowind as well. It's like, okay, I'll give this another try, and I'm glad I did. I played it through twice, and I'm going to kind of talk about what I like, what I didn't like about the game, and all that as kind of we go through here. And for me personally, it's been more good than bad with Oblivion Remastered. So definitely glad that I gave Oblivion another chance after, whatever it is, close to 20 years since it came out. So I have done 2 playthroughs here of Oblivion Remastered. My first playthrough was a pretty thorough one, not quite 100%. I didn't do like every little dungeon and all that, but I did a good amount of the NPC quests. Certainly most of the NPC quests I ran into and exposed I did. And I did the Arena, the Fighters Guild, the Mages Guild. Didn't do the Dark Brotherhood or the Thieves Guild. But I did do the Shivering Isles and all the kind of added DLCs and all those sorts of things too. And I would say that doing that complete of a playthrough was a mistake. I'll talk a little bit about that in the bugs section later on. But I think this is definitely one of those games where you're better off doing a smaller run through of it, just because there is so much content here that it can start to feel a little bit repetitive in certain ways. Running into the same elf voice actors and voice actors for the different races eventually starts to get a little bit old. And there is a lot of repetition, doing a lot of the Aelid, however you pronounce that, ruins over and over again. There aren't that many different dungeon types. So doing a bunch of different dungeons, it starts getting a little bit repetitive. So this is definitely one of those games where I think doing a more concise playthrough, a little bit more focused, is a better way to do this type of game, I think, than trying to 100% it, where you're kind of almost waiting for it to end by the time you get to the end of it. That is a common problem that I've run into when I try to 100% games, even Elden Ring, which I love. I had that problem on my first playthrough where I was doing every single dungeon, and so help me God, if I had to kill one more of those cats with swords to get a friggin' spirit ash at the end of Catacombs. Games that focus on scope are usually not meant to all be done in one run. So someone who has that completionist sort of thing like I do, that little bug, have to kind of like tamp that down a little bit and train myself to do a tighter playthrough of a game. And I think that was true when I came back and did my second playthrough. I actually waited, it's been however many months since the game came out, so 9 months, something like that. Came back to it after some time off and did kind of a little bit of a tighter playthrough. And I actually had a pretty good time with it, better than the first playthrough. I'm not going to go too much into superficial aspects of the appearance of the game, like the graphics and stuff like that. It certainly has graphics. There are graphics in this game, and boy, do the characters have faces and all that. But that's not something that's important to me in a game, so whether the graphics are high fidelity, low fidelity, doesn't bother me quite as much, so much as like art direction and things like that. So I'm not going to really spend much time on like the superficial appearance of the game. I mean, I'm someone who played through the 16-color EGA version of Quest for Glory 1 and 2 recently, so graphics don't bother me one way or the other, good or bad. So I'm going to start with a few of the things that I don't like, get those out of the way before going into probably a longer list of things that I do like. High up on the list of things I don't like, I still don't like the scaling of enemies in this game. I don't like how it feels to have weaker enemies disappear in later portions of the game, to be walking into every random inn and everyone is dressed in like millions of dollars worth of equipment. I want to be able to go into places at endgame and just smack trash characters around too. That like gives you a feeling of progression. Next up, I really dislike the interface for a lot of things. Browsing through long lists of items that seem to kind of sort semi-arbitrarily it's not great. Things like alphabetical order. I would put it in alphabetical order sort mode and the items wouldn't be in alphabetical order. It was very janky, very hard to get through long lists of items. I feel like that's something, if you're going to remaster the game, fix really long scrolling lists of items, especially when you're doing things like alchemy. It just gets very slow and difficult to work through. The setting, I don't know if bad is the right word, but it is just very vanilla. I fell in love with Morrowind being kind of like this alien kind of place. My favorite game for years was Planescape Torment, which again is a very kind of interesting kind of alien setting in a lot of ways. And Cyrodiil's very kind of vanilla, generic, medieval. The Oblivion gates are interesting the first time or two you do them, but you do a lot of them in the game and they cease being interesting after a while. So the setting is definitely not my favorite. The feeling of like the cities and stuff like that, they're kind of bland. This next one is kind of a general problem with Elder Scrolls games, and I would say it's too much of a reliance on humanoid enemies. It is a fantasy setting. Let's get funky with some more like non-humanoid enemies, some fantastic monsters, horrible beasts, stuff like that. I think Morrowind had, the robotic dwarf automatons and like flying rays and stuff like that. There's really nothing that feels that crazy or exotic in this game, and that's a little bit disappointing for something in a fantasy setting. And then the combat itself, I mostly played with melee characters in my 2 run-throughs here. It definitely could use some sprucing up with a little bit of more modernization, doing a remaster here. There's a lot more quality of life things that would have worked and helped out a lot here. Things like lock-ons, like you have in like a Souls-like game, would have helped greatly here, particularly in a game that has friendly fire. Being able to lock on to enemies would be a pretty good feature to add, I think. I did have a couple of minor bug issues as well that kind of were frustrating. One was save corruption. I ran into that a couple of times where I had to rewind a couple of saves because apparently areas can become corrupted, And then if you save your game in that area, that save file, you can't reload it without the game crashing. So I just developed habits in terms of saving indoors in small rooms and stuff like that whenever I can. Because I only ever had the bug in the overworld. I never actually had it happen inside of a dungeon or inside a house. Overworld areas, I had save game corruption happen a couple of times. That was pretty frustrating. And then on my first playthrough, I almost rage quit before the end of the game because I was trying to do a pretty complete playthrough, and I was trying to do all the Oblivion gates that I could, whatever it was. There's like a maximum number you can get, and I was trying to do all 60-something of those Oblivion gates. And the last one wouldn't spawn. Like, I was literally down to the last Oblivion gate. It showed up on my map. It showed up, and I couldn't enter it. I reloaded my game, and it was gone. Sometimes I'd go back to that area, it would pop up in some, like, partial incomplete state, and I could never enter it. And, I had spent tens upon tens of hours hunting all these things down, closing them up, and the very last one was bugged. And I had no idea how many save games I was gonna have to go back to get that to open up correctly. Almost rage quit the game at that point. But yeah, that was a nasty bug to run into after a significant time investment. Eventually I just had to chalk it up as a loss. Like, okay, I'm going to be one shy of closing all the gates, and that's just the way it's going to have to be. One of the weakest points of the game to me is bosses, or there really is kind of a lack of challenging bosses in the game. When you get to the very end of like the Mage's Guild quest and you run into Manny Marco and you expect like this epic necromancer who's going to be summoning hordes of undead, and you kill him in like 3 hits. It feels bad. Same thing with Mankar Cameron at the end of the game. Everything's been building up to this epic, powerful magic user who can, open rifts to Oblivion and let hordes of demons surge through, and you can just paralyze him and kill him in 2 hits, even on master difficulty. Not quite 2 hits, but pretty close to it. Upsettingly easy is the way I describe the bosses in this game, and I really wish they would have done a better job somehow of making those feel a little bit better. And I think that's probably my biggest criticism, is that feel of the end bosses never felt epic. And it's not just that they die quickly. They don't do anything epic. They're still, at the end of the day, fundamentally, they built it so that they follow the same rules as the protagonist, when really they should have had some kind of game-breaking abilities of their own, like summoning a horde or something like that. So now I'm going to move on to things that I do like about this game. And number one is kind of common in a lot of, I think, the earlier Elder Scrolls games. Don't know how Skyrim lines up with this, but at least in this game, as well as the earlier games, it is very refreshing how Bethesda unabashedly lets you make broken-ass builds. I love that. I love that it is essentially up to you to decide your own difficulty in this game. You want to play a godlike character? Go ahead. You can make someone who is invincible to all damage and who the enemy no longer reacts to. They give you, the player, agency in determining whether or not you want to play the game that way, or you want to play the game in kind of a little bit more of a higher difficulty mode. I feel like a lot of games these days, because they have multiplayer components, they spend a lot more time on balance, or at least multiplayer components are a lot more common. And it's nice to play a single player only game where they just really don't have to give a shit about balance. And you are allowed to make something that is phenomenally powerful and just feel like a truly, almost like a god walking around ants. For me, that is a great feeling in a game. I don't like that in every game, but it's nice. It was a refreshing change up to play that. What I just said is logically inconsistent between saying bosses were too easy but loving having an overpowered character. And I get that that kind of sounds a little bit inconsistent, but I think there are things they could have done on the boss design that even would have made like a little bit more of a challenge, even for OP characters. You can make bosses have extremely high resistances or immunities to things like, crowd control or paralysis effects. You can do things like phase changes where they have immunity periods where they unleash a nova as they undergo a phase change. Things that are at least interesting and game breaking in a way. Let the bosses break the game too. I would say I mostly like itemization in this game. There are a couple of exceptions to that where I don't like, there's certain extremely powerful items that are kind of just randomly generated and you either have to save scum or farm them. That I'm not a huge fan of. But I do like generally that a lot of the extremely powerful items of the game are kind of deterministic in nature, right? You can go do specific quests to get the Daedric artifacts, to get the escutcheon of Chorrol and the Blade Turn Hood. I generally greatly enjoy games that has deterministic gearing where go to place X to get item Y, and that's how you get this item. That is a lot more fun to me than waiting on the roll of a dice to get an item. So I do think they hit a pretty good balance here with that in terms of having a lot of items where you can just go to place X to get item Y. And, there's a little bit of randomization in terms of getting jewelry and stuff like that and farming those. But I think they hit a pretty good spot there. I also love the item enchantment system here, where, again, you can make very broken weapons. And the balancing side of it in terms of having very small numbers of charges, it feels pretty good to have a very powerful but weapon that's kind of limited by a small number of charges. I think I kind of like that methodology in terms of how they did that. I do wish there weren't quite so many limitations on the souls you can absorb, the souls you can't absorb. Things like Dremora, stuff like that, I feel like you should be able to absorb those. Editing this little bit in here, I should also add that the Morrowind system, where you could either refuel it from a soul gem or from just waiting, I think that was better as well. They get downgraded from Morrowind to Oblivion, but still overall like it. But aside from that, I generally really like being able to say, I want these enchantments on this weapon. I just need to go find those spells, find those abilities, and I can make the weapon I want that has those enchantments. I much prefer that system than to the systems of a lot of modern ARPGs where it's entirely a random roll of the dice, which really just ends up wasting my time. There's also a good amount of fun jank in this game. I talked about some bugs that frustrated me earlier on, but there are things in this game that are genuinely wacky and funny. Watching, a distinguished countess pathing on her way to a temple to meet the emperor, and she walks over the top of a tent to get there. That is there's nothing that breaks the game about that. It's just funny jank. Similarly, hitting quest NPCs with my fatigue draining sword, and they fall face down in the dirt, but they're still able to respond to me normally. Again, funny jank. I remember winning the epic Battle of Bruma and getting a statue put up in my honor, and I'm wielding a magic staff that's in my inventory that I never ever used in this glorious statue, and my head is clipping through my cloak. It's some would say it's immersion breaking. I just think it's funny. Bugs can be fun too. I definitely greatly prefer the leveling system that is in Oblivion Remastered to the one that was in the original Oblivion. I don't like what my character ends up being capable of to be tied to my every last little exact action. Sometimes I just want to tell a video game, I want to be this type of character and make my character that way. I don't necessarily want it to feel like work to make the character I want to make. In this game, the level progression in this versus the original Oblivion, it felt more like I could just play the game rather than work to get the character that I wanted to get. And that was a nice change that helped me get a little bit more into the remaster than I did into the original version. The scope of the world felt good. running through the world, jumping off mountains, and you almost have this sort of floaty superhero kind of feel to it when you're running around at super speed and jumping off massive cliffs and not taking any damage as your acrobatic skill goes up. I kind of like that. I can get that people maybe don't like that aspect of it, but zipping around over this kind of scenic vista, it felt pretty good to me. I kind of liked that roaming feel, kind of running around. Even though it was a little bit vanilla in terms of setting, it felt pretty good to be, just running around the world from place to place, zipping through with lots of little points of interest to find and explore. I like the darkness that's worked into certain aspects of the game as well. The example I'll give here is the end of the arena quest, where you end up essentially just executing a sad person in an arena because you help them find out their past. That is something that's like, it's almost like an assisted suicide in the game. That's dark, and the game lets you do that. That level of darkness in some of the quests and some of the interactions is, kind of an interesting thing that you don't see that often. I think the Glarthier quest is another one that's like that, where you have the paranoid guy and there just isn't a good ending to it. It just ends bad no matter what you do. I like those kind of dark paths and quests that are worked in there. The battle experiences along the lines of the main plot, I think, are pretty satisfying as well. The battle at the Bruma Gate, where they're opening up the Great Gate, is something that feels pretty good. And one of my favorite things is just early on in the game, the battle for Kvatch. That was something that actually felt pretty chaotic in a good way. Having to fight off the kind of like horde there with allied soldiers who you can friendly fire and hit by accident. It felt like a chaotic battle scene, almost like a medieval magic version of something from Saving Private Ryan a little bit. That felt really good to me, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but something about the feel of that battle with soldiers on both sides, both that one and the one outside the Bruma Gate, felt really good to me to play through. I actually really like a lot of the dungeon design in this game. That does come with the big asterisk of this is best if you do a tight playthrough and aren't doing a lot of the smaller, more procedurally generated ones. They were probably procedurally generated and then manually tweaked sort of dungeons. But I'll kind of mention a few of the ones here that really kind of stick out in my mind is just well done dungeons to explore through. And the first one I'm going to mention is literally the first dungeon you see in the game after you get out of the sewer tutorial area. And it's kind of funny in that this particular dungeon is a better tutorial area, in my opinion, than the sewers. And this is the Ayleid Ruin of Vilverin, right when you get outside. And it kind of ticks a couple of bases off for me. It has a good variety of enemies in it. You start off with human enemies at the top, working your way deeper towards undead enemies. You have environmental hazards and traps that are scattered throughout there. You have a seed of a quest later in the game where you can find a statue that triggers a whole range, this great exploration quest that's huge and can take you all over the world if you're interested in doing one of those more thorough playthroughs. It has a rarity in this game, which is a named boss at the end of it. Unfortunate rarity. I wish they did that more often, but it's just having a little necromancer with a name and a note associated with it makes the experience so much better than just having a random mob generated at the end of it. And even just seeding events for later in the game where you get exposed to the blue stones, the Wilkind stones. That plants a seed for later in the game where along the main quest you have to find a great giant version of one of those. Really great introductory dungeon that's right in front of you when you get out of the sewers. There are two that are kind of dream related that are actually really good as well. Arkved's Tower for Vermina's Daedric quest is a really interesting one that, if you go through it, just visually very cool. Similarly, there's a nightmare-related one for a Nightmare Darkly quest in Bravil, where you know, these are kind of going through chaotic visions in someone's head. And both of those are really kind of cool, interesting dungeons that kind of are memorable. And then my favorite overall dungeon is actually the one from the Mehrunes Razor DLC. And the whole Sundercliff Watch area, that entire zone, which is a very, very big kind of dungeon to explore through, is the closest thing to like a legacy dungeon almost in Elden Ring in this game. I really love that area. You have several mini bosses going through it. You have a named boss at the end. You have factions fighting each other. It has areas that just make it feel lived in with, you know, troop quarters and things like that. Little hidden secrets and all these little different areas where you can find random treasures and stuff like that. And a good payoff in terms of reward at the end. Really satisfying area to go through that seems really, well, it doesn't seem, it's really well made and really entertaining to engage with. So yeah, the dungeon design in this particular game is fun to play through. There are a lot of small dungeons that are, you know, a little bit bland, a little bit repetitive, and frankly a little bit of a editor's touch would have been nice there. But games like Elden Ring have that problem too. So coming from the perspective of someone who did not enjoy the original Oblivion, I actually had a pretty good time with Oblivion Remastered. I'm not one of the people who has rosy nostalgia for the original Oblivion, so like the deviations from that original form don't really bother me that much because I wasn't enamored with the original form. But I think I had a more enjoyable time with this than I did with the original release, whether or not that's the changes they've made to the game, or it's that my tastes have changed. You know, it's probably a little bit of both. But yeah, I had fun playing Oblivion Remastered. And not only did I have fun playing it, it encouraged me to maybe go back and play Morrowind again, which I think is also a good thing. I haven't touched that in 20 years, over 20 years. And this kind of, you know, made me a little bit excited to go back and try that again. And I do think that if you're someone who's never played an Elder Scrolls game before, keep an eye on this one and look out for sales. I think it's still $50 at the time I'm making this, which is kind of a lot for essentially a remastered old game. But keep an eye on the price, and if it gets down to a level where you're a little bit more comfortable with it, give it a shot. If it's something where, like me, you don't have nostalgia for the old game, where them changing things is going to bother you, I had a good time with it, coming from that perspective. So if you're someone like that who either hasn't played Oblivion before, or you either didn't like the original release, maybe keep a lookout for sales for this game, and when it gets down maybe a little bit in price, give it a shot. I had fun with it, and maybe you will too. All right, thanks for listening.